Welcome to the Ghastly Journal, where we uncover the most perplexing mysteries hidden in the forgotten corners of our world. I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of the most bewildering cases in modern history. A case that defies explanation and challenges everything we think we know about reality itself. This is the story of Millbrook Falls, the town that vanished overnight. Before we begin, I should warn you. What you're about to hear will disturb you. The disappearance of Millbrook Falls isn't just another missing persons case or unexplained phenomenon. It's something far more unsettling. Something that suggests the boundaries between what we consider possible and impossible are far thinner than we'd like to believe. So settle in, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for a journey into one of the most chilling mysteries of our time. On the morning of October 15th, 2019, the world woke up to discover that an entire town had simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed by natural disaster, not evacuated due to emergency, but gone. Completely and utterly gone, as if it had never been there at all. The town of Millbrook Falls, population 3,247, had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions that continue to haunt investigators to this day. But here's what makes this case truly extraordinary. It's not just that the people disappeared. The buildings, the roads, the very infrastructure of the town seemed to have been erased from existence. Where Millbrook Falls once stood, there was nothing but pristine wilderness, as if human civilization had never touched that particular patch of earth. And perhaps most disturbing of all, the outside world seemed to have forgotten the town ever existed in the first place. I've spent the last 3 years investigating this case, interviewing witnesses, analyzing evidence, and following leads that have taken me to the darkest corners of government archives and scientific institutions. What I've discovered will challenge everything you think you know about the nature of reality itself. This isn't just a story about a missing town. It's a story about the fragility of existence, the power of collective memory, and the terrifying possibility that our world is far more malleable than we ever imagined. The story begins with Sarah Chen, a traveling pharmaceutical sales representative who had been making regular visits to Millbrook Falls for over 2 years. Sarah's testimony provides our most detailed account of what the town was like in its final days, and her experience on that fateful October morning serves as our entry point into this bewildering mystery. Sarah had always enjoyed her visits to Millbrook Falls. The town was nestled in a valley between rolling hills in rural Pennsylvania, about 40 miles from the nearest major city. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the local diner served the best pie in 3 counties, and where the pace of life moved just slow enough to remind you of simpler times. The town had a small hospital, a few pharmacies, a main street lined with locally owned shops, and a population that took pride in their tight-knit community. On the evening of October 14th, Sarah had checked into the Millbrook Inn, a charming bed and breakfast that had been family-owned for 3 generations. She had dinner at Murphy's Diner, where the waitress, a woman named Betty, who Sarah had known for 2 years, served her the usual coffee and apple pie. They chatted about Betty's daughter's upcoming wedding, the unusually warm weather for October, and the town's preparations for their annual harvest festival. It was a perfectly ordinary evening in what seemed like a perfectly ordinary town. Sarah went to bed around 10 o'clock, planning to make her rounds to the local pharmacies the next morning before heading to her next appointment in the neighboring county. She had no way of knowing that she would be the last person to see Millbrook Falls as it truly was. When Sarah woke up the next morning, something felt wrong immediately. The sounds were different. Instead of the gentle hum of morning traffic, the distant conversations of early risers and the familiar creaking of the old inn's wooden floors, there was only silence, an absolute profound silence that seemed to press against her eardrums like a physical weight. Sarah checked her phone. No signal. She tried the landline in her room. Dead. When she looked out her window, expecting to see the familiar view of Main Street with its quaint storefronts and morning activity, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Dense forests stretched as far as the eye could see, ancient trees with thick canopies that looked like they had been growing undisturbed for centuries. Confused and increasingly frightened, Sarah grabbed her belongings and rushed downstairs. The inn was completely empty. No staff, no other guests, no sign of life whatsoever. The front desk was abandoned, with the guest registry still open to the previous day's entries. Sarah's name was there, along with 3 other guests who had been staying at the inn. But the building itself felt hollow, as if it had been vacant for years. When Sarah stepped outside, the full scope of the impossibility hit her. The Millbrook Inn was still there, exactly as she remembered it, but it was surrounded by wilderness. No roads, no other buildings, no power lines or telephone poles. Just the inn, sitting inexplicably in the middle of a forest that looked untouched by human presence. The morning air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the rustling of wind through the trees. Sarah tried to retrace her steps from the previous evening, looking for Murphy's Diner or any of the other familiar landmarks. She found nothing. Where Main Street should have been, there was only a deer path winding between towering oaks. Where the town square should have stood, there was a small clearing with a stream running through it. Where the hospital should have been, there was nothing but more forest. For hours, Sarah wandered through the woods, calling out for help, searching for any sign of the town or its people. She found nothing. No buildings, no roads, no evidence that Millbrook Falls had ever existed. Just wilderness, pristine and undisturbed, as if it had been that way for thousands of years. Eventually, exhausted and terrified, Sarah managed to find her way to what she believed was the location of the main highway that had brought her to Millbrook Falls. The road was there, exactly where it should have been. But it ran straight through the forest with no exit ramp, no signs indicating that a town had ever existed in the area. When she flagged down a passing motorist, the driver looked at her with genuine confusion when she asked about Millbrook Falls. "Never heard of it," the man said, studying Sarah with concern. "You feeling all right, miss? There's nothing but forest out here for miles." Sarah's attempts to convince the driver that there had been a town, that she had just spent the night there, that thousands of people lived in the area, were met with polite but firm insistence that she must be mistaken. The driver offered to take her to the nearest hospital, worried that she might be suffering from some kind of breakdown or medical emergency. This was Sarah's first indication that something far more sinister than a simple disappearance had occurred. It wasn't just that the town and its people were gone. It was as if they had been erased from existence itself, wiped from the memory of the outside world as completely as they had been removed from the physical landscape. But Sarah remembered. She had receipts from her purchases, business cards from local contacts, photographs on her phone from previous visits. Or at least, she thought she did. When she checked her phone, the photos were gone. When she looked through her wallet, the business cards had vanished. The receipts she was certain she had kept were nowhere to be found. The only evidence that remained was the Millbrook Inn itself, standing impossible and alone in the middle of a forest that shouldn't exist. Sarah's discovery of the impossible inn would be just the beginning of a mystery that would consume investigators for years to come. When she finally reached the authorities, her story was met with skepticism, concern for her mental state, and ultimately a police investigation that would yield results no one was prepared for. Detective Marcus Rodriguez of the Pennsylvania State Police was assigned to Sarah's case. A 20-year veteran with a reputation for thoroughness and a healthy skepticism toward unusual claims, Rodriguez initially approached the investigation as a routine missing persons case. A woman had become disoriented, possibly suffered some kind of psychological episode, and was making claims about a town that didn't exist. It should have been straightforward, but Rodriguez was a good detective, and good detectives follow evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads to places they'd rather not go. His first step was to verify Sarah's story through official channels. He contacted the county planning office, the State Department of Transportation, and the Postal Service. What he found defied explanation. According to official records, there was no town called Millbrook Falls in Pennsylvania. There never had been. The zip code Sarah provided didn't exist. The address of the Millbrook Inn led to empty forest. The business licenses she claimed to have seen, the municipal records, the tax documents that should have existed for a town of over 3,000 people. None of it could be found, but Rodriguez didn't stop there. He decided to visit the location himself, accompanied by Sarah and a small team of investigators. The drive to the coordinates Sarah provided took them through increasingly rural Pennsylvania countryside, past farms and small communities that definitely existed in all the official records. When they reached the area where Millbrook Falls should have been, they found exactly what Sarah had described: pristine wilderness, ancient trees, and sitting impossibly in the middle of it all. The Millbrook Inn. The building was exactly as Sarah had described it. A charming Victorian structure with a wraparound porch, detailed woodwork, and a hand-painted sign that read, Millbrook Inn, established 1892. The guest registry was still open on the front desk, with Sarah's name clearly visible along with 3 other guests who had supposedly checked in on October 14th. The rooms were furnished, the beds were made, and there was still food in the kitchen that looked like it had been prepared for breakfast service. But the inn was surrounded by forest. No roads led to it. No power lines connected it to the grid. No water mains or sewage systems supported it. It simply existed, as if it had been carefully placed in the middle of the wilderness by some unknown force. The building showed no signs of decay or abandonment, despite being completely isolated from any infrastructure that should have been necessary for its operation. Rodriguez and his team spent hours documenting the scene. They photographed everything, took measurements, collected samples. The inn was real, solid, and perfectly preserved. But according to every official record, every map, every database they could access, it shouldn't exist. And more disturbing still, none of the local residents they interviewed had ever heard of Millbrook Falls or the Millbrook Inn. The investigation expanded. Rodriguez contacted the FBI, who initially dismissed the case as a local oddity. But when federal agents arrived to conduct their own assessment, they found themselves facing the same impossible situation. The inn was there, physical and undeniable, but it existed in a vacuum of official recognition that made no sense. Agent Patricia Wells, a specialist in unusual cases, took over the federal investigation. Her first instinct was to look for evidence of an elaborate hoax or some kind of psychological experiment. But the more she investigated, the more she realized that the scope of what would be required to fake such a thing was beyond the capabilities of any known organization. To create the illusion that a town had never existed, someone would have had to infiltrate and alter records in dozens of government agencies, private companies, and institutions. They would have had to erase evidence from state and federal databases, remove entries from phone books and directories, alter maps and satellite imagery, and somehow convince thousands of people to pretend they had never heard of a place where they had lived and worked for years. But perhaps most importantly, they would have had to physically remove every trace of the town's infrastructure. Roads, buildings, power lines, water systems, sewage treatment facilities. All of it would have had to be demolished and the land restored to its natural state overnight. The logistics alone would have required resources and coordination on a scale that seemed impossible. Agent Wells began to consider more exotic possibilities. Could this be evidence of some kind of experimental technology, a government project gone wrong, a natural phenomenon that science hadn't yet explained? Her investigation led her to contact researchers in fields ranging from quantum physics to psychology, searching for any theoretical framework that might explain what had happened to Millbrook Falls. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a theoretical physicist at Princeton University, was among the experts consulted. Her specialty was the study of parallel dimensions and the possibility of multiple realities existing simultaneously. When presented with the evidence from Millbrook Falls, Dr. Vasquez admitted that while the case was extraordinary, it wasn't entirely without precedent in theoretical physics. There are models, she explained to Agent Wells, that suggest reality might be more fluid than we typically imagine. If you think of existence as a kind of fabric, it's possible that under certain conditions, parts of that fabric could be folded, twisted, or even removed entirely. The mathematics are incredibly complex, but the basic principle isn't impossible. Dr. Vasquez suggested that what had happened to Millbrook Falls might be an example of what she called dimensional displacement. The town and its people hadn't been destroyed in any conventional sense. Instead, they had been shifted to a different layer of reality, leaving behind only fragments, like the inn, that somehow remained anchored to our dimension. But even Dr. Vasquez admitted that the energy requirements for such a phenomenon would be enormous. Whether it could occur naturally or would require some kind of technological intervention remained an open question. And if it was technological, who had the capability to make an entire town disappear? The investigation took another disturbing turn when Agent Wells discovered that Millbrook Falls wasn't unique. Her research uncovered reports of similar disappearances dating back decades, possibly centuries. Small communities that had simply vanished from official records, leaving behind only scattered evidence of their existence and witnesses whose accounts were dismissed as delusions or hoaxes. In 1987, a mining town in Montana called Cedar Ridge had reportedly disappeared overnight, leaving behind only a few confused residents who insisted they had driven there for work that morning. In 1952, a fishing village in Maine named Beacon Harbor had vanished, with only the lighthouse keeper's wife claiming to remember its existence. In 1923, an entire neighborhood in Detroit had supposedly been erased from maps and memories, leaving behind only a few scattered buildings that officials claimed had always been isolated structures. Each case shared common elements with Millbrook Falls. Complete erasure from official records, witnesses whose accounts were dismissed, and physical evidence that seemed to exist in defiance of documented reality. But the cases were separated by decades and thousands of miles, making it difficult to establish any clear pattern or connection. Agent Wells began to suspect that she was dealing with something far larger than a single unexplained incident. If her theory was correct, there might be a systematic process at work, something that periodically removed entire communities from existence for reasons that remained completely unknown. The breakthrough came when Wells discovered a classified government document from 1962, buried deep in the archives of a defunct military research program. The document, heavily redacted and marked with the highest security classifications, contained a single paragraph that made her blood run cold. The Project Tabula Rasa has achieved preliminary success in localized reality manipulation. Test subjects show no awareness of alterations to their immediate environment. Recommend expansion to larger-scale applications pending further evaluation of containment protocols. The document was signed by someone whose name had been completely blacked out, and the project it referenced seemed to have been terminated shortly after its creation. But the implications were staggering. If the document was authentic, it suggested that the U.S. government had been experimenting with technology capable of altering reality itself, possibly as early as the 1960s. But who was behind Project Tabula Rasa? And if the technology existed to make entire communities disappear, who was using it and why? The investigation was about to take a turn that would lead Agent Wells into the darkest corners of government secrecy and scientific experimentation. As she prepared to dig deeper into the classified archives, Wells couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her phone calls were being monitored, her movements tracked, and her investigation was drawing attention from people who preferred to remain in the shadows. The disappearance of Millbrook Falls had opened a door to secrets that powerful forces wanted to keep buried. The deeper Agent Wells dug into the classified archives, the more she realized that Project Tabula Rasa was just the tip of an iceberg that stretched back decades. Her security clearance allowed her access to documents that most federal agents would never see. And what she found painted a picture of systematic experimentation that made her question everything she thought she knew about her own government. The files revealed that Project Tabula Rasa had been part of a larger research initiative called Operation Clean Slate, which had operated under various names and classifications from the late 1940s through the early 1980s. The project's stated goal was to develop methods of selective memory manipulation and reality alteration for national security purposes. The applications, according to the documents, ranged from erasing enemy intelligence assets to creating false historical narratives that could be used to destabilize foreign governments. But the most disturbing revelation was that the technology had apparently been tested on American citizens. Small communities across the United States had been selected as test sites, chosen for their isolation and lack of political influence. The goal was to perfect the process of making entire populations disappear from both physical reality and collective memory, leaving no trace that they had ever existed. The scientists involved in the project referred to these communities as test environments and their residents as subjects. The clinical language used in the reports was chilling in its detachment. Men, women, and children were reduced to data points in experiments that treated human lives as expendable resources in the pursuit of impossible science. Dr. Harrison Blackwood, the project's lead researcher, had documented the process in meticulous detail. His reports described a technology that could manipulate what he called reality anchors, the fundamental forces that kept people and places tethered to existence. By disrupting these anchors, entire communities could be shifted to what he termed null space, a dimensional pocket where they would continue to exist but remain completely cut off from our reality. The process wasn't perfect. Some elements always remained behind, fragments of the original reality that resisted the displacement. Buildings, objects, sometimes even people could be left stranded in our dimension while the rest of their world disappeared around them. These remnants were referred to in the documents as echo artifacts, and the project team had developed protocols for dealing with them. Agent Wells found herself thinking about Sarah Chen and the Impossible Inn. Sarah had been an echo artifact, a person who had somehow remained anchored to our reality while everything around her shifted to null space. The inn itself was another echo, a building that had resisted displacement and now existed as a monument to a town that no longer officially existed. The documents revealed that echo artifacts were considered acceptable losses, minor inconveniences that could be managed through disinformation campaigns and psychological manipulation. Witnesses like Sarah were typically discredited as mentally unstable, their accounts dismissed as delusions or hoaxes. The few physical remnants that remained were either destroyed or quarantined, hidden away from public view. But Project Tabula Rasa had officially ended in 1983, terminated after what the documents described as catastrophic containment failure. The details of this failure were heavily redacted, but Wells could piece together enough information to understand that something had gone terribly wrong. An entire research facility had been lost, along with its staff and the surrounding area. The project had been immediately shut down, its files sealed, and its surviving personnel reassigned to other duties. Or so it seemed. As Wells continued her investigation, she began to find evidence that the project had never truly ended. It had simply gone deeper underground, operating under new names and with more sophisticated security measures. The disappearances had continued, but they had become more careful, more selective. Instead of entire towns, they were taking smaller communities, isolated groups that wouldn't be missed by the outside world. The pattern became clear when Wells mapped the locations of reported disappearances over the past 4 decades. They formed a rough grid across the United States, with clusters concentrated in areas of low population density and minimal government oversight. Rural communities, mining towns, religious communes, and other isolated groups had been systematically erased from existence, their disappearances explained away as mass relocations, natural disasters, or simple abandonment. But someone was still operating the technology, someone with access to resources that defied imagination, someone who could manipulate government records and control information on a massive scale. The question was who, and more importantly, why were they continuing the experiments? Wells found her answer in a series of memos dated just 6 months before the disappearance of Millbrook Falls. The documents, classified at the highest levels, revealed that the technology had been sold to a private corporation called Nexus Dynamics, a company that officially didn't exist but appeared to have connections to defense contractors, pharmaceutical companies, and tech giants across the globe. The memo suggested that Nexus Dynamics was using the reality manipulation technology for commercial purposes. They were erasing communities that stood in the way of development projects, removing populations that might resist corporate expansion, and creating blank spaces that could be used for classified research facilities. The disappearances weren't random acts of scientific experimentation. They were calculated business decisions, human lives sacrificed on the altar of corporate profit. But the most chilling revelation came in a document dated just 2 weeks before Millbrook Falls vanished. A memo from someone identified only as the architect outlined plans for what they called Phase 2 of the operation. The small-scale tests were ending. It was time to move to larger targets. The memo included a list of potential sites for future displacement events. Major cities, entire counties, even small states were being evaluated for removal. The technology that had once been used to erase mining towns and fishing villages was being scaled up for applications that would affect millions of people. The implications were staggering. If Nexus Dynamics succeeded in their plans, entire populations could be erased from existence. Their disappearances explained away as natural disasters, mass migrations, or simple changes in demographics. Wells realized that she had stumbled onto something far more dangerous than a single unexplained disappearance. She was looking at evidence of a conspiracy that threatened the very fabric of reality itself, and the conspirators knew she was getting close. The first sign of trouble came when Wells returned to her hotel room to find it had been searched. Nothing was missing, but everything had been subtly moved, positioned just differently enough to let her know that someone had been there. Her laptop showed signs of tampering. Her phone had been cloned and her rental car had been fitted with a tracking device. The message was clear: she was being watched, and whoever was watching her had the resources to monitor her every move. But Wells was a federal agent, trained to handle threats and equipped with the full authority of the U.S. government. She wasn't going to be intimidated by corporate spies or rogue scientists. That confidence lasted until she tried to contact her superiors at the FBI. Her calls went unanswered. Her emails bounced back as undeliverable. And when she tried to access her official databases, her security clearance had been revoked. According to the system, Agent Patricia Wells no longer existed as a federal employee. Her badge number had been retired, her case files had been transferred to other agents, and her access to classified information had been permanently terminated. The speed and thoroughness of her erasure from official records was terrifying. In less than 24 hours, someone had managed to remove her from the federal bureaucracy as completely as they had removed Millbrook Falls from the map. She was being given a taste of what the residents of the disappeared towns had experienced, the gradual realization that the world was forgetting they had ever existed. But Wells had an advantage that the residents of Millbrook Falls hadn't possessed. She understood what was happening to her, and she had prepared for this possibility. Before beginning her investigation into the classified archives, she had created backup copies of the most important documents and hidden them in locations that even Nexus Dynamics couldn't access. She had also established contact with journalists and researchers who specialized in government conspiracies, people who would continue her work if something happened to her. The final piece of the puzzle came when Wells received an unexpected visitor at her hotel. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the Princeton physicist who had consulted on the case, appeared at her door looking haggard and frightened. She had been contacted by someone claiming to be a former member of Project Tabula Rasa, a scientist who had worked on the original experiments and was now trying to expose the truth about what had happened to the disappeared communities. The scientist, who identified himself only as Dr. Morrison, had reached out to Dr. Vasquez because of her expertise in dimensional physics. He claimed to have information about the true nature of the displacement technology and the location of the null space where the disappeared communities had been sent. But he would only meet with Wells in person, and only under conditions that guaranteed his safety. The meeting was arranged for a remote location in the mountains of West Virginia, far from any surveillance networks or populated areas. Dr. Morrison had chosen the site because it was near one of the original test locations, a place where the dimensional barriers were thin and the effects of the displacement technology could still be measured. As Wells prepared for the meeting, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a trap. The timing was too convenient, the offer of information too perfect. But she also knew that this might be her only chance to learn the truth about what had happened to Millbrook Falls and the other disappeared communities. The drive to West Virginia took her through increasingly remote countryside. past abandoned coal mines and forgotten settlements that seemed to echo with the ghosts of vanished communities. She found herself wondering how many other places had been erased from existence, their disappearances so complete that even the memory of their loss had been forgotten. The meeting location was a defunct research station that had been abandoned decades earlier. The buildings were still standing, but they were overgrown with vegetation and slowly being reclaimed by the forest. According to the coordinates Dr. Morrison had provided, this had been one of the original test sites for Project Tabula Rasa, a place where entire families had been displaced to null space in the name of scientific progress. Dr. Morrison was waiting for her inside the main building, a thin man in his 70s with wild gray hair and eyes that held the haunted look of someone who had seen too much. He introduced himself as Dr. Richard Morrison, former head of quantum mechanics research for Operation Clean Slate. He had been one of the scientists responsible for developing the displacement technology, and he had been living with the guilt of his actions for over 4 decades. "They told us it was for the greater good," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They said we were developing tools that could prevent wars, eliminate threats to national security, create a safer world for everyone. We believed them because we wanted to believe them. We were so focused on the science that we forgot about the human cost." Dr. Morrison explained that the displacement technology worked by manipulating quantum fields, creating pockets of altered space-time that could be separated from our dimension. The process required enormous amounts of energy, but once initiated, it was self-sustaining. The displaced communities continued to exist in null space, but they were completely cut off from our reality. "They're not dead," he said, his eyes filling with tears. "They're still there, still living their lives, but they're trapped in a dimensional prison with no way to return. We created thousands of ghost towns, populated by people who don't even know they've been displaced. They go about their daily routines, completely unaware that their world has been severed from ours." The revelation was staggering. The residents of Millbrook Falls weren't gone. They were still there, still living in their town, still going about their daily lives. But they were existing in a parallel dimension, a pocket of space-time that had been cut away from our reality like a tumor excised from healthy tissue. Dr. Morrison claimed that he had been working for decades to find a way to reverse the process, to reconnect the displaced communities with our dimension. He had made some progress, but the technology required to bridge the dimensional gap was beyond his resources. He needed help from someone with access to government facilities and classified research. But even as he spoke, Wells noticed something troubling about Dr. Morrison's story. The details were too perfect, the timing too convenient. And there was something about his eyes, a glassy quality that reminded her of the photographs from the Millbrook Inn. She began to suspect that Dr. Morrison might be another echo artifact, a fragment of a displaced reality that had somehow found its way back to our dimension. The truth, when it finally emerged, would prove to be far more complex and terrifying than anything Wells had imagined. The meeting in West Virginia was indeed a trap, but not the kind she had expected. and the real nature of the displacement technology would challenge everything she thought she knew about the boundaries between reality and nightmare.